Welcome, whoever and wherever you are, to this keynote on deep hospitality in the liberal Quaker tradition. I'm Rhiannon Grant. I'm a researcher and a writer who works for Woodbrook. I'd like to thank Wendy Cooler for inviting me to give this talk as part of her series on Testimonies of Mercy. As well as deep hospitality, I want to talk about radical welcome, and I'm going to explore what hospitality and welcome might mean in the Quaker community. I'm going to reflect on the Quaker community around me, the situation I see there, and some changes that I think might, hopefully, happen in the future. I don't claim to have all the answers, or even any answers, but I'm a big believer in trying to ask good questions and see what happens when we start from there. I hope you'll take what I offer here and sit with it in prayer as I have sat with it in the writing and the preparation. I hope you'll test it, experiment with it, play with it, see where the Spirit moves in it, listen for what resonates with you, use what helps, and discard the rest. I'm going to start by exploring my own location within the Quaker community and wider society. I'll move on to explore some themes around diversity and inclusion, welcome and hospitality, tradition and transformation, and finish with some suggestions and then some questions. What we observe depends a lot on where we're observing from. I can't climb above my own Quaker community in order to look down on it all from a height, even if I might sometimes like to. I have to try and find the patterns from where I am. And sometimes I feel like an ant walking over a carpet, knowing that the colours are changing beneath my feet, but not being able to see the shapes and work out the pattern or the design. That being so, let me start by sharing with you some of the detail of my situation so that you can relate it to your situation, compare it, and together we can start to make connections. So where am I? I'm a British Quaker. I've been a Quaker all my life, not in membership all my life, but part of the community all my life. I grew up attending a children's meeting in England fairly regularly, and I was involved in some of the activities arranged for Quaker teenagers. When I left home for university, I was determined to try out other churches. And my very first week, I went to an evangelical church with the Christian Union. They were beautifully welcoming. They invited students into their homes after the service. They gave us a homemade lunch, which compared to what we got in the university canteen was a huge luxury. But during the service itself, I had disagreed so strongly with the content of the sermon that I very nearly stood up and answered back. I knew enough Quaker history to know that early friends might well have done just that. The next week, I had breakfast with the Christian Union people who were setting out to church, and then I went to the local Quaker meeting, and that part of my decision was made. The Quaker meeting that I chose to attend, one of two I could easily have reached on a Sunday morning, was a small one. They were meeting in a rented room. They knew each other well. They made the effort to get me to stay after meeting and socialise, even though my instinct was, as it always has been and still is very often, to get away as soon as possible. The first time I gave spoken ministry in that meeting, I used the word God. And afterwards someone commented on that, pointing out, correctly, that not all Quakers in Britain today share an understanding of the divine. I wasn't yet ready to work on that question directly, but it planted a seed. I went on with my academic work, a degree in theology and philosophy, and I went on with my spiritual journey at the same time, which took me to the other larger local meeting when they ran a series of meetings called Quaker Quest. Quaker Quest is a program designed to help liberal Quakers explore their faith with people who know little or nothing about Quakerism. As you might know if you've ever tried it, that sort of exercise has two audiences, really. There's the explicit audience, people who know little, maybe have come to Quaker meeting a few times, maybe have seen a poster been intrigued by the word Quaker, maybe have walked past the meeting house and wondered what happens there. The other is a hidden but a very real audience, the people who know something and are asked to speak. The people who get involved in running and organising, and in that process need to listen to themselves as well as to others, and quite often discover that they have more to say than they'd previously thought. I was very much in that latter group. I'd known for some time that I wished Quakers did more to speak up about what we do, what we know, what we think, what we believe. And I'd already done my best to represent Quakers when questions about religion came up at school. It's not always easy to be in a religious studies class as the only Quaker. But Quaker Quest was the first time I had space to prepare rather than being put on the spot. The first time I had an audience who were willing to listen really deeply, and I found it hugely nurturing of my growing call to ministry. I've been talking anecdotally, but let me tease out of these stories some of the themes which are relevant to hospitality. When did I feel welcomed and when did I not? When was I able to welcome other people and when was I not? I usually felt welcomed by the Quaker meetings in these stories, at least in theory. Others don't always have the same experience. I recently heard from someone who turned up at a new meeting and stayed for refreshments after worship, hoping to talk to some new people. But after drinking a cup of tea alone, feeling awkward as everyone else in the room spoke to each other, went home without having a conversation at all. Before we get on to deep hospitality, we need to make sure that we're doing the basics well. A smile, a greeting, a question. We can keep it simple. There's no need to second guess ourselves about someone is there. We might do well to focus on shared experience. I like to be asked, how did you find the worship today? But I don't think we've met before. I'm Rhiannon. I'm whoever you are. Or even, do you like this weather? It begins a conversation. Someone visiting might look out of place, but you're not from round here, are you? Why are you dressed like that? Or other people your age don't come to this sort of thing, do they? Best left unsaid. And those are all real examples of things that have been said to me or people that I know, things that actually don't make people feel welcome. Although people tried to welcome me into Quaker communities, sometimes I felt that they didn't really know what to do with me. Groups of older adults, and at the time of some of these stories I was 19 or 20, so almost all the adults were older than me, and they tended to wonder whether I should really be with them. Shouldn't young people be off with other young people? In Britain, we have a wonderful group called Young Friends General Meeting, who get together at different meeting houses for weekends and apparently have a lovely time. I was invited, but it didn't appeal to me, and I never went. As a university student, I was spending all day with others more or less the same age as me anyway, and I've never really liked age-banded environments like school. I was an adult, and I wanted to join the main Quaker community. I'm glad that the option of Young Friends General Meeting is there for those who want it, and I've heard from some of them that it's amazing, but it wasn't something that was for me. I did get the message sometimes, though, that refusing to go into the appropriate box in that way wasn't especially welcome, which might help to explain why some people who've been part of Young Friends General Meeting find it hard to then move on and join local Quaker meetings. Since you can't stay a young friend forever, even if you manage to raise the upper age limit well beyond the usual understanding of young, I think that means that at least some of those people are lost to the Quaker community entirely, or at least until they get old enough to return to the Quaker community and be welcomed as a properly old adult. That said, when I turned up at Quaker meeting over and over, and especially when I turned up to committee meetings, accepted volunteer roles, and did what I said I'd do, people started to trust me and to find other things for me to do. I didn't find the process of integrating into the community easy, but that's also true for my experience of other groups, and let's face it, that might be about me or about group dynamics in general, rather than the Quakers specifically. But I think it might be helpful to dig deeper into some of the relevant factors here. I've talked about age because when I was in that situation, that was the factor which seemed most salient to me at the time. It was the factor which people mentioned. It was the factor which they used to suggest that maybe actually I ought to be somewhere else. It was something which they commented on when they said how glad they were that I was there. But there were a number of other factors which I haven't discussed yet. Gender, race, education, class, invisible disability, sexuality, and more. I'm not going to go through all of those in detail, but I think it's worth looking at some specifically to see how they might be working in this particular context. Being a woman in the religious society of Friends in Britain in the 21st century is being part of the majority. Roughly 2/3 of Quakers in Britain are women, and women take leadership roles, welcomed me, gave me lifts to meetings, and ran the meetings. But there are still gendered dynamics, and women step forward first, in my experience, to make tea and to ensure people's comfort, while men are more likely to be nominated onto property and finance committees. With a membership that's 2/3 women, too, even a 50-50 division of speech between men and women in a meeting means that men are speaking more than their individual share. In my time, I've been patronised by older people of all genders, but sometimes there are elements which suggest that gender is relevant. Older men making jokes which sexualise me as well as putting me down, and older women suggesting that I should be trying to get pregnant rather than staying in education, for example. Often I think people don't even realise what the implications of their comments are, but because of those dynamics, I'm sure that being a woman has had some effect on which tasks I'm asked to take on and which roles people expect me to perform in the community. Not in a rigid or absolute way, but in a way which becomes visible as a pattern over a long period of time. That ant crawling across the carpet begins to notice the stripes. Similarly, being a white Quaker in Britain today is being part of the majority. In the last few years, we've made some steps forward as a community in naming and addressing the racism which is present. Not racism that's unique to our community, because there's a good deal in wider British society as well, but present among Quakers despite the fact that it's clearly contrary to our understanding of the equality of all people. I still witness racist comments and assumptions being made, though. Everything from assumptions about the style of worship naturally preferred by people of colour to comments made on Facebook. I expect that I sometimes still, accidentally, unconsciously, make mistaken and harmful assumptions myself, and for those I apologise. If you feel generous enough to call them to my attention, it's always welcome because that helps me to continue improving. Knowing all that, I also know that being white has made it easier for me to play a full role in the Quaker community. My education and class background play similar roles. I'm familiar and comfortable with middle-class attitudes to everything from politeness and language use to the way we talk about money and time. Having been a Quaker my whole life, I've had opportunities to see how people have changed their attitude to me as I gained more education. Perhaps there's also an element about getting older, but finishing a degree, and especially finishing a PhD, changed how people treated me. Because I don't use my title in everyday life, because as a Quaker I think it shouldn't matter, because I want to meet everyone on an equal basis, and titles seem likely to get in the way of that. There's sometimes a moment when I'm teaching a group when they realise that I'm not just a mid-30s white woman, but that I also have a PhD. I had a very clear example of this once with a small group who had been not badly behaved, but they were being awkward. They were working hard to ask me difficult questions, to challenge me on the material I was delivering. In some ways, I was enjoying that. I certainly didn't mind. But I did notice when we broke for coffee and happened to have a conversation about titles in which I mentioned that in some university or formal contexts, I would be Dr. Grant. And then in the session afterwards, the group were noticeably more willing to go along with my ideas. They gave more weight to what I said than they had before they knew about my education. Obviously, my education also affects what paid employment I might be offered, and I have to suspect that it affects which Quaker work I'm asked to do too. Sometimes that's justified. My PhD is directly about Quakers, and it gives me specific expertise in one very small area of Quaker studies. But other times, I think it's a general air of educatedness, which isn't really relevant to the role. I hope with those examples that you're starting to get the idea of the kinds of patterns I'm identifying here. There are ways in which my social location and the privilege which goes with it makes it easier for me to be and feel welcomed into the Quaker community. And there are also more minor ways in which my identity means that I am or feel excluded. That might not be as simple as oppression. Age-related discrimination, for example, can work in lots of different ways, and it's not clear to me that either younger adults or older adults are straightforwardly privileged in society as a whole, only that people sometimes make unfounded assumptions based on age, and that age is relevant to what you're expected to be able to do, and the stereotypes that people have about you. The consequences in these cases often don't map onto people's intentions. The people who said to me, for example, "Oh, do you know about Young Friends' General Meeting? You should go," didn't mean to make me feel unwelcome. In fact, they probably wanted to do the opposite. They wanted to make sure I knew that people my age have a dedicated space in the Quaker community. For some people, I'm sure that works. There are certainly young friends who have a great time in that dedicated space. But for me, the thing which became annoying was the predictability of the response, the way it was repeated, and especially when it was not accompanied by a willingness to let me be involved in the way that I chose in the local Quaker community. But what should that involvement look like? What did I want? In practical terms, a welcome into the Quaker community usually means welcome into service for the Quaker community. Let's look at that in more detail because it has complex implications. When someone new arrives at meeting, what's the first thing we ask them? Have you been to a Quaker meeting before? Is typical. Often hand already reaching for the leaflet about what to do in a Quaker meeting. Because if you think you're coming to a church service and you find yourself in a silent, unprogrammed Quaker meeting without warning, it might be distressing for everyone. But if it turns out that the person doesn't need the leaflet and then they come back a second week, would you be willing to serve on a committee? May not be far behind. I think the man who grasped my arm and said, "Fresh blood," the first time I visited a meeting was probably joking. Hard to be entirely sure, though. And it can be just as bad to look at someone who comes week in and week out and assume that they don't want to serve or have nothing to offer. Service is important to our community, and I often have mixed feelings about the things I'm asked to do. On the one hand, looking back, while I was still in my teens, I was asked to serve on the Children's Committee, which feels like it might have gender stereotyping behind it. On the other hand, at the time I was pleased to be involved, was also volunteering with a non-Quaker youth group, took the work seriously, and did have at least a little to offer to younger members of the community. Similarly, being called fresh blood was a bit much, but spending months in a new meeting and having to volunteer rather than wait to be nominated in order to get something to do also felt a bit excluding. Some of this is the normal hits and misses of human communication, all the things which go wrong just because we're different people and can't guess what others want or how they'll respond. There is something deeper, though. In those cases, who or what do we expect to change? Is the meeting community the fixed point, with the people who arrive fitting into the spaces in the structure, or not fitting in unless they change? Or are the people at the centre, with the structures built around them? When we have structures, especially structures which we value for their stability and long traditions, it can be easy to lose sight of their purpose. The purpose of a Sabbath day is rest, but as Jesus said when he and his disciples were found picking wheat on a Sabbath, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. He doesn't, we can notice, put down the Sabbath as a whole or say that we shouldn't have one. Rather, it seems to me that he's objecting to a particular attitude which involves judging what others are doing. The people who question him are labelled Pharisees in Mark's Gospel, but they could be anyone who is out watching what someone else does and trying to catch them out, rather than attending to their own prayers and rest. The rule of a day of rest was made for our benefit, so we should find ways in which it serves us positively, rather than making it a negative for others. There's a whole possible digression here, by the way, about Quaker history, about whether one day is different to another, about whether it's okay to sell things on a Sunday, whether there's any benefit to holding meeting for worship on a Sunday rather than another day. For the purposes of this talk, suffice it to say that it's complicated. I'm going to return later to a point about special days, and we can have another conversation some other time about history and theology to do with that. Let's go back to committees instead, and service. Were the committees in your meeting made for humans, or humans for the committees? Even in a strong view of Quaker discernment, in which God commanded us to set up committees, those commands may not be for all time. What is the light of Christ showing us now? Sometimes we make changes which are only tinkering with the surface, perhaps adjusting the number of people on a committee or reorganising them without going down to the heart of the matter. I think we might need to do more. I feel the Spirit calling me to invite us all to go beyond rearranging the table, bringing in an extra chair. Let's talk about changing the whole menu. The title of my talk is Deep Hospitality, and now I want to introduce something that I understand as closely related: radical welcome. Something which is radical goes to the roots or the foundations of whatever is done. And radical welcome asks us to welcome people in a way which will change us too. For example, a radical welcome of refugees to the UK at the level of government could mean changing the place and way in which we accept asylum applications to ensure that people can travel safely rather than needing to rely on smuggling themselves into the country. A radical welcome of refugees to the UK at the level of a town or city might mean changing the way we use public spaces and funds to support them, changing the way we work together, and even changing our understanding of what our community is and what it does. A radical welcome of refugees to Quaker meetings might mean creating new ways to interact with our community, such as offering translations or practical support, anything from a mobile phone with internet access to taxi fares. And since I'm not a refugee, probably hundreds of things I can't even think of, since these examples are based on my observation and imagination and stories that I've heard rather than lived experience. In order to find out, we need to meet people who are in that situation and get the information from them directly. Radical welcome is very different then to allowing someone to be a guest. When someone stays as a guest in my house, I expect them to follow along more or less with the way things are already done. When someone becomes a member of the household, on the other hand, they get a say in changing the rules. A guest can help themselves to a drink in my kitchen. A generous and trusted guest might help with the cooking. But a guest doesn't get to reorganise my kitchen, and I wouldn't expect them to tidy my cutlery drawer. But when my wife moved in and we became one household, we did exactly those things together to make sure that both of us would have what we needed easily accessible. We even bought new frying pans and extra plates. An ironic thing about delivering this as a talk is that I can't offer you a radical welcome here because this is a one-way conversation, because I don't know who you are, I can't respond to you, and I can only talk about radical welcome in the abstract rather than modelling it as I might in a workshop where I can change the questions that we ask about in response to the things you ask. In your Quaker community, do you feel like a guest or a host? Do you feel like a member of the household? There's a passage in Britain Yearly Meetings, Quaker Faith and Practice, which dramatises this by picturing the Quaker community as a working vessel. If the society can be thought of as a ship, I would like to be one of the crew and not a passenger, and to be seen like this, Jai Penner wrote. This different image gives very different implications, although it's apparently similar to my picture of a household and a guest. Crew are expected to be working, and on a ship large enough to have many crew members and many passengers, the crew would normally be paid. The passengers, meanwhile, are probably paying, although the cargo, not mentioned in the analogy, might be the main money earner. When we attend to the power balance in this situation, we might imagine the captain asking the crew to do what passengers ask, even if it's not entirely reasonable, because the crew are in a position of service. We also imagine that it's hard to cross that line. To move from a passenger role to a crew position requires a formal recognition and probably a training process, an induction. That makes sense in the point the analogy was created to make, which is about the importance of offering service and taking on roles within the Quaker community. We're all crew, it says, and we should all be working on behalf of the community, not sitting around like passengers. But neither the passengers nor the crew here are being offered a radical welcome. The structure of the situation is determined by the ship's owner and perhaps the shipbuilder and the captain, maybe even the structure of the ship herself, and probably by the economics of the area she sails in. In being Quaker and thinking about radical welcome, we might then detect a tension between wanting to maintain our tradition and wanting to be open to new members and their insights. To understand this better and to move towards a creative resolution of this tension, I want to spend some time looking more deeply into the nature of Quaker tradition. We cannot afford to fool ourselves here with either exaggerated claims of a clear and changeless continuity, or overemphasize the lack of tradition and pretend that we start building from the ground up every week. Between these two extremes, what's the reality and the truth of the Quaker tradition? What's core, what's changeable, and above all, what should be changed? In Vanessa July's 2021 Carey lecture and accompanying Pendle Hill pamphlet, she gives us the image of the Quaker community transforming into a butterfly. At the moment, we're a caterpillar, gathering resources, but also not yet in our most beautiful form. We have seen that Quaker structures are run through with racism, sexism, unfounded judgments and assumptions about gender, colour, class, age, ability, and many other things. When a caterpillar transforms inside the pupa, it keeps only a few basic building blocks that image all discs, and most of the body it has grown dissolves into a protein-rich soup, which is then used to create the body and wings of the butterfly. This image points us to the depth and completeness of the transformation which we'll need. I have to say, though, that dissolving into a protein-rich soup is somewhat outside my experience. In order to think further about what might be involved in this process, I looked for a metaphor which it was easier for me to imagine myself in. When do we really take something apart entirely and transform it into something else? One time when I take things apart entirely is when I'm playing with Lego. Have you ever played with Lego or another building block system like it? There are lots of ways to use Lego, but one of the things you can do with it is take things apart. You can build a model car, for example, according to the instructions in the book, or with tweaks because you can't find exactly the right brick, or according to a design entirely of your own. And then, when you've built it and run it round the room, or however you want to play with it, you can take it apart right down to the components, and you can use the same pieces, exactly the same pieces, to build something else entirely. The new thing might be another car, or it might be a house, or a boat, or a car, house, boat, tree, rabbit, depending on your interests, imagination, and inspiration. But it isn't as simple as it sounds. In order to bring your imagined creation and the real Lego together, you have to get to know the Lego pieces. You have to look at each one, understand the shape of it and the colour if that interests you, and be able to work out how to fit them together to make the shape that you're thinking about. It's physical, so you can do that with trial and error, but there's also a skill to being able to imagine how the pieces will connect before you bring them together. If you work with someone else, you have to develop words to describe the pieces, because a Lego instruction book is entirely visual. It works in diagrams. So my family, and probably many others, have a selection of terms, probably baffling without context, but perfectly clear if what you need is to be past a 2x4, no, a thin 2x4. Similarly, in my Quaker community, I might need eldership or a nomination, and the ability to imagine what those will be like depends on our experience of them in the past. We can do things by trial and error. We can also use our imaginations. In my description of creating with Lego, I talked about interest and imagination, and I also used the word inspiration. In Lego, the game is often as much in the building process as the result. As we transform our Quaker community in order to be able to provide a radical welcome and deep, ongoing hospitality, we need some things to be functional, to be able to hold worship, to handle money, to offer pastoral care to one another. But sometimes it's okay if things collapse. What feels like a total collapse might be a way of revealing the underlying structures. Being in the process and knowing that we'll need to continue to build and demolish and rebuild and add to something might be more important than trying to get a perfect solution the first time. I don't think it's helpful to prop up something crumbling and pretend that it's fine. If my Lego tower is too tall, it will fall. And there are times when it's better to take it down and rebuild in a more stable way than to try to keep adding more and more buttresses to the side. Through this process, in the Quaker community, the Spirit moves. If we imagine the Spirit as air, it's already there in our Lego buildings. Most Lego bricks are actually hollow, and little pockets of air are built in all over, just as we have air in our lungs. To me, welcoming the Spirit, the air within the bricks, the inspiration that comes through us, seems absolutely key to this process. The caterpillar is guided by genetics as it becomes a butterfly, and the Lego creation is guided by a builder's imagination. And we must rely on the guidance of the Spirit as we're transformed. But what does that actually mean? It's traditional, at this point in a liberal Quaker conversation, to start saying things like, well, it means different things to different people. We all have different experiences. Different people prefer different language. There might be a list of words offered which we can choose from or add to. God, light, love, spirit, energy, universe, mother, father, ground of being, eternal, or whatever we call it. All these points are true and useful. The list can feel welcoming, and it certainly tries to include different perspectives. But if I'm to be true to my Quaker experience, I need to say something more than this. We do have different experiences, even in the same meeting for worship at the same time. That's not really an observation about worship, but about experience, because we'd notice different things about the same sunset or respond differently to the same artwork. We do, in the liberal Quaker community, have plenty of different words to describe our spiritual experience. Sometimes that's a matter of putting the same thing in a different way, as when we call water H2O in certain technical contexts. Sometimes it's a matter of different experience. I went to the beach on a sunny day, and someone else went on a stormy day. Sometimes we're tempted not to take these differences seriously enough, bundling everyone's experiences and words together into a list or metaphor about all climbing the same mountain. Sometimes we exaggerate these differences to the point where they incapacitate us. We don't have to know everything in order to affirm and trust in what we do know. Is God an external being or power, or something internal to the world or the human being? I don't know. Maybe neither, although personally I suspect some of all of the above. What's the best pronoun to use for the divine? I don't know. Often I just say God again, or light, or love, or I rotate round 3 or 4 options, because the ground of being can express themselves as he, she, they, it, we, or through no noun at all, but through being loving and beautiful. Here are some things I do know. When Quakers gather together to seek the will of God or the way forward, it works. We get some guidance from somewhere and can discern what we should do. Not always what those present want to do, or what any group in that position would do, but things which are right for us in that time and place. This works with lots of different Quaker groups, with a few friends gathered in a living room, with a group meeting by Zoom, with a group who identify as non-theist, with several hundred people, even with several hundred where half of them are in a physical room and half of them are joining remotely. In respecting our theological diversity, I don't want us to put down the power of our method and the things we discover through it. We're not just led at random. We have differences, but we can also see patterns in the discernment developing over time. We have been led to refuse physical violence by the state and search for ways to build peace. We have been led to speak out for the value of all people and the need for justice and equity. We have found love and truth to be core principles. That experience tells us something about what guides us. Love and truth are so core that we have sometimes used them as names for our teacher. When we're loving and truthful, we are Godding in our own small ways. If we offered a radical welcome to that of the divine within us, what would that look like? Is truth a member of your household or a guest? If you took apart your Lego and rebuilt what the Spirit shows you, what would it be? Enough play with metaphors. I'll stop talking about Lego now, and I'll pick it up off the floor before anybody steps on a brick. I want to move on in the final part of today's talk to some concrete possibilities for change. I'm going to go through 9 ideas which are all very different. They work at different levels. Some we can change as individuals or meetings, others need wider discernment. I don't know whether any of them would work, but I feel energy around them, and I want to share them with you so that they can be explored further and tested among us. Which ones feel hospitable to you? Idea 1 is to relax about our history. We have a tradition, but we don't have to be precious about it. George Fox isn't the best china plates. He was a human being with an extraordinary gift for connecting with God in himself and others, and encouraging other people to do likewise, but he was also deeply wrong about some things. People sometimes say that he wouldn't recognise the religious society of Friends today, and they use it as a way of criticising some change or other. But I think we should lean into this. Fox wouldn't recognise us. Excellent! Look how far we've come. Isn't it great that we can keep receiving new guidance and responding to new situations? This will also make it easier for us to name and own other times when we or our community have been wrong about things, when we've been racist, when we've harboured abusers, when we've excluded the disabled or uneducated, and many, many other sins. Idea 2 is to accept that we now keep times and seasons. While there's still a spiritual truth to the idea that all days are equal, and that Christmas and Easter, the resurrection and incarnation of Christ, should be available to us at all times, in many meetings, even in the liberal tradition, there's been a gradual movement away from the testimony against recognising the liturgical year. These festivals are either forgotten entirely. I almost never hear Quakers talk about Pentecost, surely one of the most Quaker Christian stories. Or they're celebrated passionately and materially with as many chocolate Easter eggs as messages about the risen Christ, possibly more. I suggest that we could be much more hospitable to people of all religions and none if we stopped kidding ourselves about this. At the moment, it's one of the places where we can be in denial to the extent to which we're embedded in a Christian culture and feel without really being set apart from it. If we celebrate Christmas, let's name that. If there are pagans or Muslims or other people of other faiths in our meetings, and there are, let's celebrate Beltane and Eid as well. Perhaps we should add some fasts. When I was a teenager, I practiced a form of interfaith interaction I called cake universalism, which meant that I'd turn up for anything as long as there was food. Is that a balanced spiritual approach? Probably not. If that's what we're doing, should we be honest about it? Absolutely. And let's serve some cake and other treats with options for different dietary requirements while we're there. Building on that, idea 3 is to focus on celebrating and not disciplining our bodies. I don't hear much about movement or posture when people talk about their experiences of meeting for worship. In fact, sometimes I even hear people talking about how it focuses entirely on the mind. When I do hear people talk about their bodies, it's usually either choosing to follow the breath as a technique for calming and emptying the mind in order to enter the silence, or practices drawn from yoga and Alexander technique, in which people hope will help them to sit still for an hour. Occasionally I hear from someone who can't sit still for a whole hour, who needs to leave to use the toilet, or needs to crochet or hold a fidget toy or something like that. There can be a value in letting go of worries about our bodies in a world which judges us by appearance. But when the only option is to ignore it, I worry that we're missing the joys of being embodied and encouraging people to neglect our physical needs. I think we need to remember that both physical silence, in the sense of the absence of sounds, and physical stillness, sitting in one place, are techniques for worship. I can do both, as it happens, although neither is especially effective at stilling or focusing my mind. A walk in the woods or a vivid visualization are at least as good, if not sometimes better. Even more rarely, I hear about someone who gives ministry during worship through movement. I think we might need a change of approach. At the beginning of the lockdowns in the UK, Quaker meetings mainly succeeded in moving to worshipping via Zoom. But some people were uneasy about this and complained about worship being mediated through the computer. Actually, as far as I can tell, worship has always been mediated through our bodies. Collective worship, with or without a computer, uses a direct and inward connection to reality, which we share through our bodies. Quaker tradition has been to discipline this, to focus on the spoken word, a very specific form of movement, and not even to allow the shaking for which we might have been named. We could change that. Let's feel cared for in our bodies as they are. Let's sit on the floor or on sofas or armchairs. Let's stand up or sing or cry out in wordless groans or laugh. Let's bring our blankets and our cuddly toys and our sewing, maybe even our notebooks, our hot water bottles, and many of us already have some flowers, and whatever helps us to enjoy our practice of being with each other, with God. Let's not make things into rules if they don't really need to be. Let's customize our committee work so that it serves us at the same time that we're serving our communities. Let's have unprogrammed worship which genuinely surprises us. Another idea is to open up. Seeing that welcoming people into our community means welcoming them into community with us, specifically as individuals, we might have to open up. Finding ways to welcome people into our hearts and our thoughts, which includes sometimes being vulnerable with them, talking about our experiences in a reflective way, such that their thoughts might change our view of ourselves, and sharing our real, potentially mistaken or disagreeable opinions. To be frank, I hate this idea. I'm an introvert. I have strong emotions, which my culture teaches me to hide. And when I do share very openly or relax enough to say things without filtering them carefully first, I often get reactions which I find strange, unpredictable, even frightening. It's one of the reasons I prefer writing or situations like teaching, in which I prepare beforehand and have some control over the situation, to informal social settings like a dinner or a party. But I've also learned that I cannot and never will feel fully in community with people when I suspect that there's something about me which they don't know and which they wouldn't like if they did know. That could be anything, but here are a couple of examples. One category of such personal attributes are those familiar to the LGBTQIA family. I'm cis, so for me it's never been my gender. But because bisexuality is often erased, I do have to endlessly come out as neither a straight woman nor a lesbian. Another category which attracts a lot of attention in my Quaker community is theology, especially, as I mentioned earlier, different ideas about the nature or existence of God. People who don't think God exists as an external reality worry about expressing that view in front of those who do, or they go the other way and assume that no rational, mature person today could ever believe in an external deity, when in fact many Quakers do experience the inward light as coming from somewhere outside themselves, or even outside the material world. People try and guess at each other's beliefs and assign them to theological categories which they may or may not accept as accurate descriptions. Because I'm comfortable with traditional language about God and light and love, people guess my beliefs are more traditional than they actually are. On the other hand, because I'm happy to try and explain a non-theist viewpoint and to speak up for the inclusion of non-theists in our community, people guess that my beliefs are less traditional than they actually are. And one time when I wrote a blog post about my theological understandings, which talked about learning from pagans, someone referred to me coming out as pagan. It wasn't a secret before, actually, but they felt they'd seen a new side of me. That truth and sharing it is part of creating a community. There are times when it genuinely isn't safe, as many LGBTQIA people around the world know only too well. The anxiety can be well-founded. But if we can't find ways to be open with one another about ourselves and our experiences, whether that's our sexuality or our theology or our disabilities or our pain or our true loves, are we really being a welcoming community? Another idea is to change our attitude to time. What if we abolished being late for meeting in the space of a single breath? What you do is this. When someone arrives at meeting after you, don't look at the clock. Smile, take a deep breath, and think, it's good that they've arrived in God's time. When you arrive at meeting, whatever it says on the clock, be glad that you can be in God's time for a while. This isn't to deny the usefulness of clocks, just to suggest that we should sit more lightly to them, and in particular, not let them rule our worship. Jesus suggested that we might want to cut out our eyes if they cause us to sin, and I think we can manage to do without some clocks if they're causing us to be judgmental and unloving. Making this change thoroughly might involve several steps. Making sure people can enter your physical room or virtual meeting space at whatever time they arrive. Paying attention to when we're really ready to enter or leave worship and what we're led to do in this moment, rather than what we planned or what we're expected to do. It might mean forgiving people who've responded harshly to our lateness or earliness in the past and given us the impression that passing on that harsh judgment is part of creating a polite, very often actually a white middle-class society. Cultivating an attitude of welcome and acceptance, even if that means uncomfortable changes to our routines. And remembering that our silence and stillness, as I said before, is a technique we use to commune with the light, and that if preserving silence for some cuts others off from our communion, it isn't really helping us as a community. It might mean making space in our lives before and after worship so that we can arrive when we're ready and stay until the process is finished, not until the clock strikes. It means noticing and taking care of our bodies while we're at worship, even if that means eating a snack or doing some stretches or leaving and re-entering the room for whatever reason. And it means being with and resilient through all the anxiety and uncertainty that these changes might create. I don't find this one easy, because I would love for everything in my life to be the same every week, really safe and predictable. But it isn't, and I have to find the faith to trust that it will all be okay, that I'll be given the strength to cope with changes. And if the price of my comfortable routine is a door locked against latecomers, which gives a visitor the impression that Quakers don't want them, perhaps even that God doesn't want them, then it's not worth it. That change about time might seem like a relatively surface level thing, but if we can't do that, how are we going to do something much more radical? What else could we do? We could have confidence. What would it take for you and for everyone in your meeting to be able to communicate confidently about Quakers? Do you understand what happens in meeting for worship and our discernment processes well enough that you could explain it to somebody else? If someone asks you what Quakers believe, can you answer in a sentence? Or do you need an hour? Or do you and wish you could change the subject? The kind of confidence I'm talking about here isn't knowing a definite set of answers where those don't exist. It's about being able to share what you do know and what you don't. Being able to explain what the question is, as well as being able to describe the facts. In Britain Yearly Meeting's Quaker Faith and Practice, there's a passage by Philip Rack which says, in part, "Please be patient those of you who have found a rock to stand on, with those of us who haven't, and with those of us who are not even looking for one. We live on the wave's edge, where sea, sand, and sky are all mixed up together. We are tossed head over heels in the surf, catching only occasional glimpses of any fixed horizon. Some of us stay there from choice, because it is exciting and it feels like the right place to be. When I talk about confidence, I'm not asking us all to find rocks. Although if you have a rock, great, please tell us about it. I've heard from some people who feel this passage is used to put down those who do experience a sense of certainty about particular claims, and I'm definitely not here to put down certainty of that kind. But it's a vivid image, and it's true that for many of us, there are areas of life where we remain uncertain. Rack is talking about the sense of what's right and wrong, but the passage gets applied to theological questions too, or why we might be more uncertain about ordinary everyday things like whether to make changes in our lives and communities. What I'm asking for is not more rocks, but more of what Rack is actually doing here, clearly articulating a position of not knowing. We can have both doubt about the answer and confidence in asking the question. We can have a huge theological diversity in our community and be able to state that plainly, briefly, and without anxiety. Some things which have helped me to reach the point where I can get in a lift, be asked what Quakers believe, and give an answer before the doors open at the top floor, include lots of practice, observing what other people say, a willingness to adapt to the situation and audience, and a trust that if I can give a little and it's helpful, someone hearing me can put in their own effort to find out more. What I say doesn't have to be a whole answer or a perfect answer. It's an elevator pitch. It just has to be better than, well, it's complicated, or getting out halfway up and using the stairs instead. Along with the confidence to express our own perspectives, we need to cultivate the strength to truly listen to others. It sounds simple. You might think you're already doing it. I was once running a workshop about theological diversity, in which I used a pretty standard listening exercise. It wasn't really there to practice listening skills as such, although that's never a bad thing to do. It was there to get the people in the room to listen to one another on specific subjects and to have the experience of feeling listened to, being listened to, rather than trying to work things through alone. So I was a bit surprised when one of the participants had a good moan about it. "I've done listening exercises before," she said. I guess other people probably feel the same, because when one person reaches the point of saying something out loud, others are often thinking or feeling that too. But I think it misses something about listening, which is that it's not a project you finish. Every time you listen to someone else, whether you've heard them before, whether you've heard them speak on that topic, you're having a new encounter with them, now, this time. Every time you create space to really pay attention to someone live in that moment, you're receiving a gift, but also giving one. In the Quaker context, we can think of this as part of the ministry of silence, which shapes a meeting for worship. As well as direct personal listening, we can benefit a lot from accepting the gifts of those who share their expertise and their perspectives more publicly. Books, lectures, TV shows, social media, fiction, as well as documentaries. We may not need to respond aloud, but a deliberate practice of creating space for other perspectives can help us to understand much more, or simply to realise how much there is we'll never know. Two more ideas to go. What if we had an invitational approach to membership? At the moment, applying for membership in an area meeting in Britain usually relies on the individual to make the first move. Very occasionally, a parent might apply for a child, but it's almost always left to the person to start the process. Meetings might try and nudge people in that direction by having a discussion about the meaning of membership, but they don't always remember or have energy. I've met people who've been attending faithfully for years who've never even been asked if they want to consider membership. I've seen nominations committees stressing over whether or not to ask a long-time attender to serve in a role which would normally be for a member, with diminishing other options as all the other members are taken up with roles or aren't able to serve. What if we flipped it round? What if instead of waiting for someone to say, I have decided to commit to the Quaker community and now I want to do the paperwork, we reached out to them? We might help them make their decision by naming what we see in them, their participation in worship and community activities, their ministry, their friendships, what they already bring to the community. They can say no. They might even be willing to explain why. And if they do, that feedback might give us hugely valuable information about the ways in which they don't feel integrated into our community. Why would you become a member if you feel like a guest? In some cases, they'll have reasons we agree with, like a prior commitment or real doubts about something we do or don't do. In other cases, we'll want to change to become a community that they can join. And finally, what if we welcomed ourselves? I spoke earlier about the way we might change our thinking about the Quaker tradition and the times our community has been oppressive and harmful. Can we make that same change for ourselves? People thinking about membership sometimes say that they don't feel good enough to be a Quaker. I've been a Quaker my whole life, and I have some idea how terrible I am in my impatience, my failure to understand other people's perspectives, thinking that I know best, my obsessive opinions about certain household chores, my lack of faith in God's provision for the future, and lots of other faults. So that idea that you have to be good enough to be a Quaker really worries me. In 2021, Mark Russ gave a talk for Britain Yearly Meeting called Why Do You Call Me Good? And in that talk, he suggests that our goodness doesn't depend on our actions. Our goodness is a gift of God, and by resting securely in God's love, we can also face up more honestly to the bad things we do. Mark talks specifically about being caught up in the structures of white privilege, and this applies to lots of other things as well. I'm sure there are people in the world who don't have the fault of judging themselves too harshly. But it seems to me that a lot of Quakers do have that quite harsh judgment of ourselves. If we are attending meeting for worship, but we think we need to be better in some way or other in order to apply for membership, are we really welcoming ourselves? If we welcomed ourselves as whole people, what would it look like? We might respond to our bodies more differently, as I said earlier. We might be more able to welcome others into our inner worlds, naming and acknowledging our faults without undue guilt, but also naming and celebrating our successes with appropriate pride. This is part of our commitment to telling the truth. For many years, I would hear people say, God loves you, and mentally add, yes, but not me. I know this isn't a new thought, but really, what if God loves everyone? Even me? Even you? If our hospitality is to go to the deepest level, if our welcome is to be truly radical, we will need to make changes. Sometimes when someone new arrives in a community, it's enough to pull up an extra chair. Sometimes when a few new people arrive, we might make do with a bigger table. But when we're facing a history of exclusion, such as that created by hundreds of years of racism, we need to change the whole menu. Let's go back to the kitchen, to the ingredients God has given us, and see what else we can cook. Let's find the spirit in 100 different recipes, and not just the ones that we're used to cooking. My prayer for the Quaker community is that we can go back to the still small voice within and find resources together which will enable a transformation now and more transformations in future. We're supported by the useful things in our tradition, but this is not the end of the journey. I'd like to finish with some questions which I hope will help you to connect this talk to your own life and community. When have you experienced true hospitality? Do you welcome your true self? Who could you welcome today? What's the most radical thing you've ever known a community to change? Who is not joining your community? How do you feel about what's been suggested in this talk? Is your meeting ready to become a butterfly?